The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, Lord.
On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered one of the villages, 10 lepers came to meet him. They stood some way off and called to him, "Jesus, Master, take pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." Now as they were going away, they were cleansed. Finding himself cured, one of them turned back, praising God at the top of his voice, and threw himself at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. The man was a Samaritan. This made Jesus say, "Were not all 10 made clean? The other 9, where are they? It seems that no one has come back to give praise to God except this foreigner." And he said to the man, "Stand up and go on your way. Your faith has saved you." The Gospel of the Lord. Ordinarily, it'd be a beautiful gospel to look at for the homily, but as you know, we've been looking at some targeted topical homilies over the last number of weeks. This is the 4th week, and we've been looking at why the church teaches that only men are ordained to the bishop and priest offices in the church. And there we've tried to give how exalted the place of woman has been in Christianity, Blessed Virgin. We've tried to look at the fitting reasons theologically why God has chosen men according to the ways in the creation and what he's achieved in the redemption, and how the priesthood images Christ in a unique way. And there needs to image even Christ in his masculinity. And last week we looked at some of the authority of the church, expressing how this particular practice, which is universal in the tradition, both East and West, is of a very high authority, and we must hold to it. And this week I want to just finish off this little series by looking at the diaconate, the deacons. As you know, there are 3 degrees of holy orders in the church: bishop, priest, deacon. And the reason I'm doing this is because similarly, there have been lots of calls in recent years that the church would open the doors to women to be ordained deacons. If some have accepted that what John Paul II said, Paul VI, and then ratified and confirmed in other ways by Pope Benedict, if they have kind of accepted that they're not going to get their way when it comes to the priesthood, then they've attempted to also then argue that maybe women can be ordained deacons and look after funerals, do baptisms, give homilies, be at the altar assisting the sacrifice of the Mass like the deacons do. And there it's an interesting question, and that's why it's worth looking at, so that we ourselves have good light on it, that we're well formed on the topic, that if someone brings it up with us, we know where we stand, what the church has said, what she's practiced, what the history shows. And then also we can help others see clearly and not be seduced, not be led astray by these modern approaches. Because the attempt to open the diaconate to women is just in the same line of thinking, which I've brought out over the last few weeks, seeing the church as a kind of patriarchal structure that has oppressed women and thereby has been the agent of a serious injustice in history. And we have to work to bring about a revolution in the church to finally have justice, equality in all the office holding. Now there, my brothers and sisters, to do that in the church is like to do what they're doing in the transgenderism now. It is to fail to accept the ordinances of God. In the creation, in fact, you don't get too many movements of men wanting to be pregnant. Every now and again, and it's true, it's in the transgender movement. You don't see it too much. We kind of accept this is the way it is in nature, and for us as Christians who believe in God, yeah, God has made it this way. Men are to be men, women are to be women. Women have the privilege of getting pregnant, carrying a child, all the beauty and treasure that can be, yes, and also the sufferings. But we kind of accept it, don't we? And most Christians do. This is the way God has ordained it. And even if maybe we come up with a better idea, normally most of us are humble enough to say, well, this is the way God's made us anyway. And it should be the same attitude in the church. Not measuring the church according to modern criteria as some kind of corrupted institution that has perpetrated injustice at this level, but to see that this is the way that God's ordained it and to try to enter into that wisdom, including on the diaconate. What we see recently when Benedict was Pope, he commissioned an investigation into this topic. And he put together a number of excellent theologians, excellent historical people, and they went back to the primary sources to look at whether there has been such a thing as a female diaconate in the history of the church. And much of what they researched is in fact summed up in this book called Deaconesses, an historical study by a French guy called Aimé Georges Mortemat, or Matamort I should say. And this is an incredible excellent historical work, working through all the historical minutiae and evidence to look at the topic. And when Benedict commissioned all of his men to do so, and they went back to the same sources that this book uses, they concluded that no, there has never been a female diaconate in the history of the church, both east and west. So there, once again, universal practice in the tradition. And the reason that a book like this has been written and there has been research into the matter is because the diaconate is a little bit more of a complex problem, complex question. Because the word deacon just means service or server in English, and it's the same in the Greek and it's the same in the Latin. Diakonos and diakonia in the Greek, or diakonoi in the Greek plural. It just means one who serves. Now, in the New Testament, when Paul is writing about the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and the teachers and other diakonoi, servers, that word can be stretched to apply to many different roles in the church, right down to someone who might arrange the chairs that people sit on in a meeting, right up to someone who might serve at the altar in the ordained ministry of the diaconate. Just like today we use the word officer. It could be someone who works in an office. It could be someone who works for the government in some bureaucracy. It could be a police officer, all of them holding different types of offices. They're serving the community in different capacities. It's an analogical word that we stretch to apply to many different realities. And it's the same with the word deacon in the New Testament. And Paul even speaks of the deacon Phoebe, who's a woman who helped him along with Priscilla and Aquila. All three women were assistants of St. Paul when he was preaching as a bishop. But the question is, what kind of deacon was she? Was she ordained, or was she just simply a servant who helped in various capacities? Because that same question has come up in the history of the church. That word has been used to describe many different types of services over and beyond just the service at the altar that a deacon or an ordained deacon might offer, and over and beyond the charity service that an ordained deacon might offer. Remember in the Acts of the Apostles, when the apostles are preaching, and they're the first bishops, they've been ordained by Christ, they realize they don't have time for all the service at table, looking after the widows, looking after those that don't have much, the poor. They need to preach the word, celebrate the Eucharist, baptize, etc., on about the spiritual mission of the church. They ordain a whole bunch of men to then do that service of charity, look after the community at a practical level, and ultimately those men that they ordain, they lay hands on them, will end up serving at the altar in an official capacity, chanting the Kyrie, chanting the gospel, sometimes preaching. And there you see that is the source, the scriptural source of the office of deacon. And it comes through the laying on of hands, just like the priests come through the laying on of hands, just like bishops are made through the laying on of hands. There's this unbroken line down through the Catholic Church in East and West. That's how you have the transmission of the ministerial offices in the church. And there, yes, there were diaconoi in the Acts of the Apostles and in the early church, and they were set up for the practical service and the liturgical service. And then the priests, they are made because the bishops are stretched. So many communities, they need extra workers, co-workers, and there they ordained priests. And those words that are there in the New Testament, episkopoi, it's where we get the word episcopacy. They are the overseers, the bishops. The presbyteroi, the presbyterate is where we get our word presbytery, etc. They are the priests, they are the elders in the New Testament. And the diaconoi, they are the deacons. But as I've said, just like the word overseer, just like the word elder, and just like the word server can be stretched in our English language and in other languages to apply to other things, this has been the case in the history of the church. And there we've got to be very careful when we see the word deacon used in the history. Is it the ordained diaconate that only men have been called into, or is it some other service? For example, in the early church, as the church came out of persecution in the 4th century, the 300s, Constantine gives an enormous religious toleration in 313, and then under the Emperor Theodosius, he basically makes Christianity the religion of the empire in around 380. And through that period, the church comes out of the catacombs, comes out of persecution, and begins celebrating her liturgy in the basilicas. They were given by Constantine to the church many jewels, many monies, many donations of extraordinary kinds because he had converted. And there the basilicas become the first churches. They were Roman legal buildings. They get converted to become the first Christian churches. And there, yes, there's an explosion of liturgical life for the first time where we can freely worship without persecution. And there the deacons have a prominent role next to the bishops. They're often seated next to the bishop. They assist at the altar, and they're often chanting many of the different prayers, the Kyrie eleison, the Gospels, etc. Very prominent roles the deacons had in the early church, as well as the practical service of the poor. But in that period, when they're baptizing enormous numbers of people who are coming into the church, they build these 8-sided structures on the entrance of the church, baptistries they're called, where there will be a pool to do immersion baptism. This is so common in the east through Turkey. And there, inside this baptistry, 8-sided structure to show the 8 days of the recreation in Christ, there's another 8-sided structure like a canopy that went over the baptismal pool. And that was because when men or women came to be baptized, they would go down into the pool and emerge out the other side, fully immersed. And to do so, they would strip right down to their undergarments, to their loincloths, etc. And there was a curtain drawn around this canopy, which is like a kind of a mini version of the overall building itself, in order to protect their modesty. And especially when it came to women, there was a great need to protect their modesty as they stripped down to their undergarments to go through the baptismal pool. And there was only there present the priest and the deacon and a few other servers. And those other servers were women, and they were given the name deacons. But they were just servers to assist because they were women. There was a need to protect the modesty of females who were being baptized. Clearly, we understand the logic there. They're choosing women to be inside, behind that curtain, whilst that baptism process goes on. And those women were often vested in a baptismal garment themselves. They had been baptized. They would wear an alb. And there they were servants, they were deacons, but not deacons ordained through the laying on of hands. They were simply servants used in that particular unique process. This was not universal. This was just in a few regions of the church. This book lays out some of the historical circumstances of how that occurred from primary sources. And there, my brothers and sisters, we have to be, intelligent, trying to understand how this word is used in its different, historical contexts. Then in the Middle Ages, you find with the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, and the European communities are glued together by the monasteries. It's the monastic life that holds Europe together through that period of the collapse of the Roman Empire and all sorts of barbarian invasions. There's so many communities gathered around the monasteries. And what occurs is that there are enormous monasteries of female religious life. Massive monasteries with hundreds of consecrated women praying together, praying the divine office, the liturgy of their hours, worshipping, living that incredibly beautiful consecrated religious life together. Men's monasteries, women's monasteries. And what we find in the history is that in the women's monasteries, the superior, the female superior, called an abbotess. You have the men, they're abbots, the females, abbotesses. They wielded, in fact, enormous authority inside the monastery because there was obedience and respect for the hierarchical structure. The women were seen as female shepherds. They would shepherd their sisters to grow in the divine life, etc. And when they prayed, they weren't up in the sanctuary. There were things called choir stalls where they're all facing inwards down through the nave, the main body of the church. The first part of the nave, I should say. There, if people came to Mass, they could join in the back part. And they would face each other and chant the office, the psalms, back and forward. And the one who was in the superior position, the abbotess, was vested in a unique way. In her baptismal alb, sometimes she would wear even a kind of thing that looked like a mitre, like what a bishop wears, and she would hold a crozier, like what a bishop holds. And it's not saying that she was a bishop. It's not saying that she was ordained. It was just a symbolic manifestation of the religious authority as a female shepherd in that female context that she exercised in love for her sisters. And there, in that context, there were some sisters who were set aside for special liturgical tasks, not in the sanctuary, not there trying to do things like the deacons, the priests and the bishops do, but in the choir stalls there would be certain sisters who were instituted with special prayers, not the laying on of hands, but special prayers prayed for them, where they would read from the sacred texts, the martyrology, which is the whole history of the martyrs, and some of the scriptural readings in the divine liturgy, in the liturgy of the hours, and they were called deacons. But it means servants, servers in the divine liturgy, in the monasteries, in a particular historical context. They were never ordained. They did not have hands laid on them in the same way. And there, my brothers and sisters, the reason I'm saying this is because there are at times people who confuse all this and look in a very simplistic way and see deacon, 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 deacon. Oh, it must be all the same thing, without understanding the historical context. And there we have to be in right order. If we're going to approach these questions and understand what they were, we need to understand the history. And this book, very well written, one of the primary masterpieces of the modern time, the scholarship is exemplary. It lays it all out. And Pope Benedict, when he did the investigation, it was concluded that there has never been a female diaconate in the history of the church in the East and in the West. And there it's kind of obvious with a proper Catholic sense, because there's only one sacrament of holy orders. There are not three different sacraments. There's one sacrament of holy orders with 3 degrees: bishop, priest, deacon. And over the last few weeks, if you've been here for the different homilies, you've heard me lay out the fitting reasons where when the priest is ordained, he's configured ontologically in the very depth of his being, the level of his soul. There's a spiritual reconfiguration that happens where he's made to be an image of Christ. Christ as shepherd, as head, as bridegroom for the church. He's configured to be an alter Christus in a unique way at the altar, So therefore he needs to image Christ right down into the very material of his body. It's a very incarnational, sacramental symbology, which is at the altar when we have a all-male priesthood, acting in the person of Christ. And there, if it's true for the bishop, who must be also the husband of one wife, and it's true for the priest, who must be the husband of one wife, it's also true for the diaconate, that they are configured different to the priest, different to the bishop, but they are nonetheless, through the laying on of hands, the deacon is ontologically changed in his spiritual soul to be configured to Christ in a unique way, in a service of charity in this sacramental order, and thereby he has to be a man, to be in that same symbology, that same incarnational symbolism in the very material of his body. He has to show forth who Christ was, and Christ was a man. It makes eminent sense that all 3 degrees would be in the same mystery but in different ways, and thereby have to be men. By the ordinance of God. Just as in the creation, it's by the ordinance of God that men are this way and women are this way. And women are the only ones that get to have babies. And in the church, by the ordinance of God, because of the mercy of God, his love, there are only men called into these hierarchical offices. And there we should rejoice and be happy that these things have been given in the church in this way, not rail against them, like I've said in previous weeks, accept what God has done for our salvation and rejoice in them and live of them, not see in them some kind of patriarchal oppression by which women have been cut out, and thereby we must rail and work and campaign and protest to bring justice to the church. We should see in the way that God has ordained these things an incredible providence, and men should be men and women should be women. And of course, it means that the priests have to be holy, the deacons have to be holy, the bishops have to be holy. Those true offices given by Christ, yes, they can be abused. And we all know about how there can be abuse of power in the church. There can be abuse of other kinds in the church. We all know about that, definitely. But that does not take away the legitimacy of the true office given by Christ. It just needs to be lived properly. And there, let us rejoice that we have these 3 offices. They have been, after the Second Vatican Council, there has been an attempt to restore the diaconate, the permanent diaconate. And there, next week, I might look at celibacy in all 3 of these offices, because it is certainly something laid down by St. Paul when he says that they all, bishop, priest and deacon, must be the husband of one wife. He's talking about they must be all married to the church. He's not talking about how they've got to have another wife, or they should not be remarried, or there should not be one who's gone to the grave and then he's got married again. Paul is speaking about each one of them in their own way, when they are ordained, are being configured into a spousal, bridal mystery, where as men at the altar, serving in this way for the fruitfulness of the bride, they have to be married to the church and live a certain continence for the rest of their lives after ordination. In fact, I think we'll look at that. I've done it before, but it's always good to recover some of these things so that we're very clear in our Catholic understanding of the sacramental nature of the church. God uses material things to show forth what he has wanted to give to us, often using and picking up and transforming what is given in the creation. Let us have hearts and minds that not only receive, but then love and respond to these things with a great thanksgiving to God, adoring and wanting to be in them, rejoicing in them always. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.